Hello everyone, welcome to the tutorials on solid principles. I'm pretty sure you all have heard about the solid principles. Some of you have implemented it as well. This is very common question that is being asked in the interviews for the developer position. I'll be explaining the solid principles using hands-on and the real-time scenarios so you can understand it better. So let's get started. What does solid principles mean? Solid principles are a set of five design principles. We call them the five pillars of object-oriented programming. They help us creating a more maintainable, flexible, and understandable software. So what does that mean? If we are creating a software, web application, or any application, if we are following the guidelines of solid principles, we can write the clean and modular and reusable code, which ultimately leads to the better software architecture and easier maintenance. You'll understand it better when we do the hands-on all these five principles. So let's get started. The first one is the single responsibility principle. It's the SRP. So what does it say? A class should have only one reason to change. This is the definition of SRP. So what it emphasizes that a class should have only one responsibility or job. That means if we are writing a class, the class should be responsible for a single kind of functionality or the similar functionality needs to be handled inside one class. For example, let's say we have a class called email service that is responsible for sending the emails to the users. Now, there could be another scenario where we have to log the emails into the database as well. Sometimes the email is failed, we store in the database. We have a bad job that will check in the database the emails which are getting failed or have the status failed, so we can try to send the email again. So to store the logs or the email information into the database, we can have another functionality, let's call it add logs. Now if we add the same functionality into the email service class, that breaks the single responsibility principle, because the email service class that we created, it's responsible for sending the emails but not saving the data into the database. So for that we can create another class, we can call it email logging. Now again, email logging is responsible for logging the email information into the database. We have created two separate classes, email service and email logging. Now we have broken down our structure into two different classes, and they both are following the single responsibility principle. So this is SRP. By implementing the SRP, each class is focused and has a clear purpose, making it easier to understand, maintain, and extend. So that's a single responsibility principle. Let's understand it by implementing it. Let's create a new solution. I'm creating a console application in .NET Core. This is the name of my solution and the project. This is where I'm saving into the directory. SDK is 8.0, language C Sharp, framework is 8.0, and Docker Spot is Linux. Let's create it. I'm using Rider. You can use Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code. It's up to you, but Rider is much better. So we will be creating the library management project. So where a student can use the library service for checking out the books or returning the books. So we are handling only two functionalities. The user or the student can check out the book, and he or she can return the books as well. So now let's get started with creating the models. We have the book model, so we create the folder first. We call it models, and in this we create the class as book. Okay, so this book class would have the title, right? I'm just going with the title only. Book would have different properties such as author, the publisher, cost, and so on. title, we will remove this set here, so we can only initialize it when we create instance of a book class. Okay, and let's add one more variable. We'll call it is available, so we can check if the book is available, then only we can let the user borrow it. Otherwise we will display the message the book is not available. Okay, so when we create the instance of our book class, that means the book is already available. Sorry, it's going to be bool. Okay, so this is it, and we can only check the is availability of the book. We cannot set it when we create the instance of our book class. So this is also wrong. I'm so sorry. Okay, now this is fine. Now we would be adding the new directory. We'll call it implementation. Implementation is actually business logic, where we would be accessing the methods for processing the return and the checkout. Let's create the library service interface, and this would have two methods. We call them process checkout, and this would have the instance of a book, which book we would want to check out. And return, sorry, I forgot to add the interface here. Okay, and when we want to return the book again, we would need the instance of a book, which one we want to return it. Okay, let's implement this interface. We call it library service.cs, and that would inherit the iLibrary service. We would implement the missing members, the methods. Now we check if book is available. We can directly print it, right? We don't have the database access where we would set the status as to book availability to false or something like that. So here we can just only display the message, the title, sorry, it would come before book.title is checked out successfully. Okay, and if it's not, we can copy this one and we can print here title is not available. Okay, now this is giving the suggestion. We can use the conditional operator to check if the book is available. We will print this one out, otherwise we'll print it's not available. That's the benefit of using the rider. Let's write it, the console.writeLine. We just have to check the book is returned. And successfully. Okay, now in the program.cs, let's remove this one. Let's use the iLibrary service. Library service is equal to new library service we have. Okay, before that we have to create the instance of a book is equal to new book. We have to pass the title. Let's go with How to Kill a Mockingbird. It's a good book, you should read it if you haven't. Okay, so we would be checking out this process checkout method, and we would pass the book here. Now this is fine, they all are following the single responsibility principle. The iLibrary service is responsible for checking out and the returning, and the book is also responsible for the book related information, title is available or not. Okay, now it's also mandatory that we check if the user is valid or not, right? Let's say we did this library is only let the students to borrow it, so no other users can borrow the book from this library. So we would have to have some authentication that would check the user. Let's say we call it is a student. Okay, again we could have a student object, right? Let's create the student object. Okay, the student would have the uh, username and password. We would go with two information: username and password. And when we create the constructor, we can pass the username and password. Username and string password. We assign them to our properties, username and password. This is the mistake I made last time. Password. Okay, so now in the program.cs we would have to create the instance of student as well. Let's say the username is user and the password is password. Okay, now when we create the library service, or when we want to check out, we want to process the checkout, we may have to pass the student information as well. So we'll have to modify this one. Okay, and we would also make the changes, sorry, here as well. Okay, so now the student would accept the student object as a parameter, and we check if student dot username is equal to user and student dot password is equal to password. That means it's a valid user, so we don't have to use the if condition here. We can directly check it like this and we'll make it a boolean. Okay, now before we check out the book, we would have to make sure if the student is valid or not. Okay, how we can check it? If is a student, we pass the student variable, then we can perform the checkout, otherwise not. Otherwise we print the user is not a student or something like that. Okay, now if you observe the code that we have written for the library service, it's violating the single responsibility principle. And I think you already have guessed it correct. This is student method. It's not the responsibility of library service. We just added it because we want to check if the student is, uh, the user is a student or not. But adding here, it violates the single responsibility principle. So now let's correct it so that our code follows the single responsibility principle. We can create the another service. We call it authentication service.cs, and this authentication service is responsible for performing the authentication related informations. Okay, now if you see, this authentication service is following the SRP, library service is also following the SRP, and the book is also following the SRP. Now our code is following the single responsibility principle. Now we have to make the changes so we can call the method is a student service. So what we can do here, we can create the variable private read only authentication service authentication. Let's pass the authentication service here. It's authentication service, and we can use this one here to check if it's a student. Now this design follows the SRP. Okay, now here for processing our request, we would have to pass the student object, This library service needs the authentication. We would have to implement it. This authentication service, we pass it here. Now we for processing the request, the first is book and the next is student. We can call it a new student directly. Oh, we already have the instance, so we can use that one. Now this is fine. Okay, console dot read, so we can see the output. Let's run it. How to kill. Okay, I gave the wrong title here. Let me correct it. How to kill a mockingbird. Now that's fine. Let's run it again. Now how to kill a mockingbird is checked out successfully, so it's working fine. So that's all for the single responsibility principle. Next we will talk about the other principle, that is open closed principle. So I'll see you there guys. Bye bye.